the mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank, and like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
Welcome to Radical Personal Finance, a show dedicated to providing you with the knowledge, skills, insight, and encouragement you need to live a rich and meaningful life now while building a plan for financial freedom in 10 years or less. My name is Joshua Sheets. I'm your host, back on the microphone after a 3-week hiatus as I have been traveling the world, most specifically traveling around Asia. And in today's podcast, I want to do kind of a casual get back together with you after too long away. And I want to share with you some of the lessons that I have learned about Asia and about my experiences there. I'm going to tell you about 6 different countries that I traveled to. We're going to begin with South Korea. From Korea, we go to Jakarta, Indonesia. Then from Jakarta, Indonesia to Singapore. Then from Singapore to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia is where I spent some time. Then from Malaysia to China, and then from China to Hong Kong. I'm going to tell you about some of the lessons for these travels, some of the things that I learned, and share with you some ideas that I think will be helpful for you. Not so much personal finance oriented, but more about kind of the direction of the world, where things are going. Now, the reason for this trip was that I was invited to speak at the Nomad Capitalist Live Conference in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. That was a great experience. I've spoken there before a few years ago in Mexico. But this time, I took it as an opportunity to, of course, not only do my job, but also to travel to Malaysia, which was a new place for me. But I thought, well, if I'm going to spend my time going all the way across the other side of the world, I might as well get a chance to see some places that I have wanted to see for some reasons that are personal to me. And then, as always, since I care about family travel and world schooling and all of that stuff, I decided to take one of my children with me. So I took my 11-year-old son on the trip with me, and we had a great time. The first of the Asian countries that we landed in was South Korea. And this was our shortest time of any of the countries that we visited. But still, I was glad to get a chance to look around Korea just a little bit, kind of get a feel of the place. And Korea completely fascinates me. And the specific theme that I'd like to talk about in this podcast is just simply this weird interplay between a comfortable modern life and culture and sustainability. Now, on this trip, I had a very brief time in Korea, but I have been interested in Korea for quite a while. I remember when I was in undergraduate university, I read a fascinating story about Korean culture that I've always thought about and the importance of kimchi in the Korean culture. And of course, since my own nation, the United States, fought a war there and has been a close ally of South Korea for many decades, I've had some interest there in the geopolitics of the place. And then over the last few years, I've gotten really interested in demographics and the future of population growth and decline. Korea is a nation that you can't avoid talking about because currently the nation of South Korea is well known for having the lowest birth rates in the world. Now, they may not have actually the lowest birth rates in the world, but they have the lowest birth rates in the world of any country that publishes reliable data. And so they do a good job with being honest and fair with their data, and that's why we look at them. And the birth rates are really shockingly low. But that's not the only thing, though. If we look at Korea, I've been amazed and super interested in just watching Korea's growth to prominence in the world of industrial manufacturing and the world of technology. Years ago, when I was a young man, Korean cars were kind of a joke. You had Hyundais and Kias, and they were a bit of a joke. Meaning that, okay, well, people are buying them, but they weren't very popular. Then over the last decade or two, I saw that Kias and Hyundais had really improved their quality, and they became great cars. I had a Hyundai minivan for a number of years that I really liked. And then over the last few years, I've been astonished at how great not only the quality of the product that they have manufactured, as automobiles is, but also just been astonished at the high level of design. I was really surprised a few years ago when I saw what seemed to be an exotic car parked in kind of an outdoor mall in Florida. And I walked over and looked at it because I didn't recognize it, and it was a Kia. It was a little Kia coupe that they manufactured. And the Kia design today is just fantastic. And the quality is high, wonderful stuff. And then if you look at the Korean production of mobile devices and Samsung and everything associated with Korean companies, they've just had an absolute economic miracle. And the situation on the ground in Korea reflects that. My time just in the capital city, all I saw was bustling modern development, beautiful skyscrapers, wonderful development, great infrastructure, tons and tons of modern vehicles. Life in Korea from an outside perspective seems absolutely outstanding. And yet, why is it that this people is going extinct? And I mean that quite literally, going extinct. Why is it in a population where, as best I can tell, you have a very homogenous ethnic group with a very proud history of they've faced all kinds of persecution and trauma over the years, been invaded by all their neighbors, but yet they continue to have a strong ethnic group, very homogenous culture. They have by all accounts, a highly functional system, a great educational system, great economy. Why does this people seem to be disappearing from the face of the earth? And let me just give you a few numbers. I won't spend too long on this, but let me give you a few numbers to put that into context. The total fertility rate in Korea is 0.7 something. I think 0.72 at the moment, and it's been declining over the past few years, even though the government has declared it to be a national emergency, and they're trying everything they can think of to raise the total fertility rate in the population. So far, nothing has been effective. So the fertility rate in the nation is, again, 0.7 something babies per woman at the moment. Could change, decrease, increase, it always will. But at the moment, those are the numbers. And the fertility rate in the capital city of Seoul is even lower. It's 0.5 something babies per woman. And there are a number of big problems that the Korean nation is facing from a demographic perspective. One of the biggest problems is a problem that we see everywhere in the world, which is the enormous attraction of in Korea's case, basically the city of Seoul. In many countries, it's the large cities, but in Korea, it's the city of Seoul. That basically Seoul has sucked up and continues to suck up all of the young people from the rest of the country. I watched a documentary by the Singaporean one of the Singaporean news channels, CNA, and they did a documentary on South Korea, and it was absolutely fascinating to see some of the interviews that they did with people in the countryside. One thing that stuck out to me was they visited a town in rural Korea, which just seemed totally beautiful, very attractive. I really liked the climate, the flora, the fauna. Just seemed like a really beautiful place to live. They visited a town, and one of the townspeople in this rural town was pointing to a house. And he said, "This is the house that has children in our community." And this particular family that was living in the house had 3 children. Those 3 children were the only children in the entire town, the entire community. I thought to myself, in my own household, I have more children than this entire Korean town was. And what was so heartbreaking was they said in a couple of months, this family is actually moving away. And so in the countryside, you have even lower total fertility rate, and you have a super aging population. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the statistics. Basically, within something about like within a few years, 20% of Korean population will be called super aged, over the age of 65. And then by the year 2050, was it half? Something like 40 or 50% of the population will be over the age of 65. Just a shockingly fast aging population. And right now, there just doesn't even seem, remember, with population, not only do you have to deal with the current total fertility rate, but you have to deal with the actual numbers of the population. Let me put the total fertility rate into context for you. What is 0.7? I'll use 0.72 because I think that was what the number was. What does 0.72 mean? Well, imagine you have a population. Let's say you have a population of 100 women. So total fertility rate is based upon the population of women that you have. So 100 women, if you have a total fertility rate of 0.72, then those 100 women will birth in the full course of their lifetime 72 babies. Okay, 72 babies. 0.72 means a population of 100 women has 72 babies. But of course, those 72 babies will be divided between male babies and female babies, men and women. So usually that's about half. So if we divide 72 by half, we wind up with 36. So you'll have a population of 100 women, which also has generally a population of 100 men. So you have 200 people. 200 people turns into 72 people, or 36 women. So in the second generation, if that birth rate of the total fertility rate of 0.72 continues, and you have 36 women, and they have 0.72 babies over the course of their lifetime, then you have a total of 25.9, we'll call it 26 babies. But now, of course, half are men, half are women. So you wind up with half, or 13 babies that are for the third generation, 13 women for the third generation. And as you have 13 women, now the trend just continues. Now, we need to be careful, of course, lest we extrapolate too far. After all, I believe things can change. I believe people will change. And when the circumstances are sufficiently impactful, I don't know, I'm searching for an adjective to use here, but when the circumstances are sufficient to cause behavioral change, people will change. And so will these numbers continue forever? Of course not. The problem is that we have no evidence anywhere in the world, as a nation has gotten rich, of these numbers ever coming up again. And so when I go to a place like Korea, I'm just astounded by how beautiful it is. It seemed totally livable. I didn't know that Costco was in Korea. I sent my wife a video of Costco, and I said, look, babe, we can live in Korea and we can solve their fertility problems because we have access to Costco, which is Joshua's definition of what you need to live a good life. But they have Costco, there's beautiful parks, all kinds of things. And you listen to the Koreans talk about the stuff why they don't want to have children. And there seems to be just a number of factors that are unique to the country. And I think these factors are so dumb. I guess just my American can-do attitude speaking. But these factors are so dumb. What do they complain about? Well, first thing they complain about is the cost of education. And as I understand it, Korean society and culture is highly competitive. And so you have this very, very competitive culture from the very beginning. And one of the ways of competing is through education. And everyone's focusing on getting a good education, getting a good education, getting a good education. And the government has government schools that are available without cost, but evidently the government schools aren't good enough for anybody. And so there's a thriving marketplace of private schools for the Korean children to go to. And evidently, young parents just can't imagine doing anything else. And so they spend all their money on private schools for their children. And as a homeschooler, I look at this and I think, well, I appreciate the desire to not be in the government schools, although I don't know anything about Korean government school philosophy or any of that. But I just look at it and say, why don't you do something that's free or cheap? If you look at the performance of unschooled children, parents who are just kind of intentionally neglectful of their children's education, these unschooled children perform just as well as graduates on the whole from government schools. So you could probably do nothing and children would turn out relatively fine. And if you, like me, are more interested in high academic outcomes and performance, then go ahead and do something, but you don't need to go to an expensive private school. Just homeschool. Everything is available for cheap or free. There's just world-class stuff available, and you don't need that much. But evidently, that's not something that has taken root in Korean culture. I don't even know anything about the laws in the nation, and this education just seems to be like this thing that keeps people from having children, and I don't understand this culturally. To me, it just seems obvious that I'd rather have 4 or 5 children around and go to the government school or rather have 4 or 5 children around and do a great homeschooling thing and get some older people. Maybe I can't work. Maybe I can't take care of the children. Let me get some of these old people that are sitting around and have them take care of my children. And I'll lay out the curriculum and they'll do an online curriculum and do everything with Khan Academy. And boom, we've got this thing solved and we'll get great results. But evidently, culturally, that doesn't seem to work for the Koreans, at least not yet. But I pointed out to say that as an outsider, someone who doesn't have any connection to Korean culture, I look at these objections and I think, this is dumb. These are dumb objections. This is so easily solvable. But I'm sure for the people who have this deep cultural bias, this deep cultural imprint, they can't even imagine seeing the world the way that I see the world. And there's a lesson in that. And the lesson from a personal finance perspective is always this, that the things that to you seem impossible are probably just arbitrary cultural artifacts that you could simply toss off if you wanted to, if you were motivated to, if you had a reason to. Similar things about the Korean culture. I'm not going to go deep into it, but I've watched some documentaries where people go into, the expectations about marriage and matchmaking and career expectations. And Koreans have this brutal work schedule where they just work all the time and long days. And they've got what seems to me weird male-female relationships where the women seem to do all the work and the men don't seem to do much of anything. And they've got this huge pressure on like academic performance. There's this one exam that Koreans have to take every year, and they shut down the cities and the noise so everything so the students can concentrate for this one exam. And so it just seems like a crazy culture to me. And when I say crazy, what I mean by that is not that I can't understand it. Of course, it's understandable. But what I look at it and say, guys, this is obviously not working. Obviously, this is unsustainable. Obviously, your people are going extinct. So change some stuff. And you see that when Koreans go abroad, for example, the United States, I can't quote the numbers, but Koreans who move to the United States start having larger families. And so clearly the culture in the United States provides for some of the needs that they're not able to have met within the culture in Korea. But I'm fascinated by what I see because people say, well, if you're rich and prosperous and you have a really functional country, then everything's going to be great. Well, it doesn't seem to be that way, at least using the metric of sustainability of a population and of a species based upon what we see in Korea. And so I suspected that that's what I would see. I could see enough with external metrics and economic data and videos and things like that. But just to go and be there, I got up early in the morning and just went to one of the central parks, and it was such a spectacularly beautiful place, a city that seemed just totally livable to me. And so as an outsider looking in, I have so many things to be jealous of. It's safe, it's clean, and again, the infrastructure worked, and the buses and the trains, and everything seemed conducive to human flourishing. But for whatever reason, on this particular metric that Korea is well known for, it doesn't seem to be working. So I really hope the Koreans can solve some of these problems and figure out a solution. They are at the leading edge of population collapse, but I don't want the Koreans to go extinct. I want to keep them around, and I hope that they can figure out some solutions. Thus far, nothing that they have done has worked, but they're smart people. They've gone through difficult times before, and I am optimistic that they'll figure out some things that may work. After Korea, we traveled to Indonesia, and Indonesia was a new country for me. And it's a country that fascinates me because I think it's a sleeping giant that may be very important in the coming years. Why do I say that? Well, I don't mean to make this the population podcast, but due to population. Let me ask you, see how informed you are, right at the top of your head. What is the most populous nation in the world? Answer that to me in your mind. What is the most populous nation in the world? What's number one? And if you know number one, what's number two? Now, for most of us, number one and number two are going to be pretty easy because these nations are the ones that take the headlines. The most populous nation in the world is the nation of India, 1.4 something billion people in the nation of India. And that's followed close behind by the former most populous nation in the world, that of China, 1.4 something billion people in China, to the extent that we trust that data. Good reasons to be wary of it, but I won't go into that. So the number one and number two nations in the world are pretty obvious. obvious, India and China. What is number 3? Do you know what the number 3 most populous nation in the world is? I think a lot of us will know this. Number 3 is the United States. The United States, 350 million, something like that, 340-something, 350-something million people, and a strong contender for number 3. And the United States also has the benefit of being a very large physical country, and of the large countries, it's dramatically underpopulated. If you look at the size of the nation of China and its populations compared to the size of the nation of the United States and its population, the United States is very underpopulated especially in terms of its carrying capacity. So, but the United States, we're a big country, very populous country, and we have a strong future for that reason, in addition to many other reasons. So now let's go to the ones that are harder. What's number 4? Now, if you're smart, you might have to think, well, why is Joshua doing this when talking about Indonesia? That's because Indonesia is number 4. I forget the exact number, fewer than 300, 280-something million people, 270, something like that. So Indonesia has a huge population, followed by number 5, which is Pakistan. And Pakistan is the 5th most populous country, in the 200-something millions, 240-ish off the top of my head, but somewhere in that range. And so I don't know much about Indonesia and Pakistan myself, but I'm super interested in them because anytime you have a country with a high population that has the opportunity to give the country the basic raw materials, the raw ingredients, to be a big player on the world stage, it's not a sufficient condition to cause a nation to be a big player on the world stage. After all, Nigeria is number 6, 7, 8, somewhere in that range, not a big player, but yet is a big player in Africa because of it. Pakistan, not a big player on the world stage, but yet a significant country just because of the number of people. And so large population is not a significant condition, a sufficient condition. But if you can get a large population together, get everyone rowing the same way and on the same page, singing from the same sheet music, then all of a sudden magic can happen. And I kind of hope and I think that that's what India is going to be able to do in the coming decades. I think India has the potential to be a huge player if they can continue to fix some of the significant problems that they have. And one of the reasons you'll hear as I talk about some of these other countries, we'll get to China, we'll talk about Singapore, but we have good examples of countries that have accomplished enormously quick turnarounds. And of course, every country has its problems, but we should pay attention to these success stories of these young nations that have basically been pulled from poverty to wealth and are making enormous strides in their human capital. Indonesia is one of those places. Now, we were only in Jakarta, and that was where my interest is. Most people know Indonesia from a place like Bali. I don't myself have any interest in a place like Bali. But Jakarta is kind of a national capital, at least current national capital. They're in the process of moving it because the whole city is sinking, is to me really fascinating. And if you go around Jakarta, you see this just huge and flourishing and growing Asian city, and it's just filled with this same kind of sense of excitement that I get anywhere I go in Asia, just due to the population and a pretty high level of development. Right now, it has an amazing price value for those who are budget conscious. I stayed in a Holiday Inn Express in Jakarta, and I like whenever I travel. I'll give you Joshua's tips on travel, at least what I've learned. Anytime I can avoid an American branded or flagged airline, I always avoid American branded and flagged airlines. So if I have the choice between flying on Delta or flying on Korean Air, I'm going to choose Korean Air. And I just do that constantly. And I do that because, well, obviously the American airlines are good at, pilots are fine, safety generally it works out. Like, okay, they have decent product, the planes are okay. I find that the customer service on airlines working with American flagged airlines is really terrible. And that makes me really sad because customer service is something that I think that Americans generally do really well. For example, customer service from waiters and waitresses at a restaurant is just always world class in the United States compared to anywhere I've ever been. You can go to just any random restaurant in any random corner of the United States and get better service than some of the finest restaurants in many places around the world. So I don't understand this, but I find American flagged airlines to be very I don't like them. However, anytime I can stay at an American flagged hotel around the world, I find the exact opposite. I really prefer American brands as compared to other brands. And of course, they're all run by local people. But if you find an American chain, a Marriott or IHG, although they're not really, is IHG still an American company? I don't think so. But they're just known for like this international standard. They work really well. So I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express, kind of just a 3-star, perfectly adequate hotel room. Nothing super fancy, but perfectly adequate hotel room. I included with that was a full breakfast, $47 in downtown Jakarta, with a great breakfast buffet, all of the international stuff, all of the Asian options, great breakfast buffet, great fit and finish in the room, no questions. $47 for my son and me for a room. That's probably the best deal I've seen on a hotel room in a long time. And so that was really interesting, that the prices were very reasonable in Jakarta. And I don't have a lot to say about Indonesia because I don't know much about Indonesia. It's fascinating to see the strong Muslim influence in the nation. Indonesia and Pakistan, both, of course, extremely Islamic countries. And so it's interesting to see that influence in an Asian context. The population of Indonesia is spread across many, many islands. The city of Jakarta was interesting to me because I had all that hustle and bustle. And yet the city of Jakarta is a pretty good example of an ecological catastrophe that is happening.
Okay, it's official. We are very much in the final sprint to Election Day. And face it, between debates, polling releases, even court appearances, it can feel exhausting, even impossible to keep up with. I'm Brad Milkey. I'm the host of Start Here, the daily podcast from ABC News. And every morning, my team and I get you caught up on the day's news in a quick, straightforward way that's easy to understand, with just enough context so you can listen, get it, and go on with your day. So, kickstart your morning. Start smart with Start Here and ABC News, because staying informed shouldn't feel overwhelming.
The entire city of Jakarta is sinking. Worse in some places, better in some places. As I understand it, it's basically due to taking too much groundwater out of the aquifers and basically poor development, overdevelopment. And so the city is experiencing terrible flooding during the rainy season. And for that reason, among other places, in addition to others, the government has been in the process for many years of trying to move the capital to a different island in a different place within the nation. In the worst case, if my memory is correct, in the worst places, the city is sinking by as much as 10 inches per year. And so there's a fascinating ecological discussion there of just poor development that can really lead to harm and hurt for a lot of people, especially people who are very vulnerable. But I'm glad to have gone to Indonesia, and I'm excited about seeing what the future of Indonesia is. If you're looking for opportunities, I don't know what all the opportunities are for Indonesia. They have actually some business visas and I'm sure some business opportunities. I just don't know what they are. From a language perspective, if you're interested in an Asian language that I think is probably going to be increasingly important in the future, and yet you haven't chosen to learn Chinese, or your children will learn Chinese, or Hindi, or some of the other well-known ones, I think Indonesian would be a really great option for you. Indonesia is probably one of the easiest Asian languages to learn. It's written using the Latin alphabet. It does not have any tones, no tonal language, not like Vietnamese and Chinese and anything else. So no tones, and a very straightforward language that is spoken by a huge population and could be a really interesting language to learn for kind of enhancing your future international business opportunities. Also, Indonesian and Malay, so Bahasa Indonesia and I can't remember if they call it Bahasa Malay, but basically the languages of Indonesia and Malaysia are very closely related. So I think I researched this, and it makes to me sense probably to choose Indonesian unless you're actually living in Malaysia. But both of them pretty easy, pretty straightforward languages to learn, and highly mutually intelligible between Malaysian and Indonesian. So put that on the back of your mind. If you're thinking about foreign languages for your children and they've learned Spanish and they don't want to learn Chinese, don't want to learn Arabic, then think about Indonesian, because it's a really probably an important country in the future. From Indonesia, I traveled to Singapore, and this was my first time in Singapore as well. My dad's favorite city has always been Singapore, that he's often talked and extolled the virtues of Singapore and has been going there for decades, but I had never been able to figure out how to go there. And I had followed and have followed the history of Singapore over the years, but it was my first time actually being there up front and close. And what a remarkable place Singapore is. What I love about Singapore especially is the story. And I think that Singapore should be very carefully studied by anyone who is interested in politics. I consider Singapore a pretty good example of what could be accomplished in the modern day under a political system with a benevolent dictator. Now, Singapore does not have a dictatorship. It's some form of democratic republic, parliamentary republic, something like that. I don't know all the details. But Singapore owes its current status in the world to its father, a man named Lee Kuan Yew. And Lee Kuan Yew is just a remarkable man. And he was involved in the independence of Singapore in the early days. He had worked for much of his early life to bring Singapore and Malaysia together. And when it finally came to be that they were going to be separate, then he worked hard with Singapore. And he had this melting pot society of people from Chinese, Malays, Indian, Tamils, and of course a strong British heritage, and bringing together all these people from different ethnic traditions to try to bring them together as a coherent country. And not a country, but yes, a country, but also a city-state. Singapore is extremely small, and yet it just punches so far above its weight in terms of its presence in the world. And Lee Kuan Yew and his compatriots basically, as I understand it, not being Singaporean, basically just looked at the world and said, how can we make super intelligent decisions that we need to make for the good of our people, no matter what it costs? And so anything that was destructive or harmful to the people, they got rid of it. And so famously, they have very strong laws against drugs. And so drugs and drug usage, drug dealing, drug possession, huge problem in Singapore. And yet they now have a very clean society because of that. Similar just public things, spitting on the streets and eating and drinking on the subways and on the transit. They have a very authoritarian, chewing gum, very authoritarian, strong laws against these social vices. And yet the outcome of that is just such a beautiful thing that it leads to such a clean and wonderful society. Similarly, they've just did so many smart things over the years, really invested strongly into education and created a government education system that was strongly focused on success and really tried to bring people together and erase some of the ethnic differences and focus on commonality. Singapore has 4 official languages in the nation, and yet they've really coalesced and brought people together where they're not so focused on their Hakka identity or whatever their other ethnic is, but no, we see ourselves as Singaporeans. Really impressive to see. And Singapore has just such a beautiful mixture of kind of classic, traditional British architecture, British influence from its role as a British colony, and yet modern development as well. And it is a beautiful place. Years ago, I watched Lee Kuan Yew give a talk, and he was talking about the importance of trees. And you see it all through Singapore. Just they've invested so much into public beauty, public trees, public beautification. And I look at Singapore and I think, what an astoundingly attractive place to live. Why can't more of our cities be done like this? Why can't more of our cities have these features of being really, really functional? And I go back to the politics of it. Again, I'm no expert on Singaporean politics, but one of the insights that changed my mind years ago was that I realized that a lot of political discussions and debates get waylaid, get destroyed because people don't have a sense of differentiation between local politics and national politics or international politics. There's a saying, a meme, that you hear, something that, on an international level, I'm an anarchist. And on a national level, I'm a libertarian. And on a state level, I'm a Republican. And on a county and city level, I'm a Democrat. And on a family level, I'm a communist, something like that. And I think there's so much truth in that meme that we often forget in a lot of our modern arguments. And especially for those of us in the United States and perhaps some other Western countries, it seems to me that this is something we really should focus more on, is we should understand that you don't have the same politics for every level of your life. And as Americans, we're such a strong-willed people and so rebellious and violent that it seems like we can't really conceive of the idea of making places better and using government power effectively. And as I go through some of this, Singapore, and I'll talk about China in a little bit, I thought a lot about politics on this trip. And I thought a lot about what rules and laws I would put myself under. When I was younger, I was always super attracted to kind of the anarcho-libertarian view on life. But as I've gotten older and thought more about the future, I realized, wait a second, that just doesn't click with how I want to live. If I have the choice to live in Singapore, and if I had the money to live in Singapore, I want to live in a city that is run like Singapore. I want to live in a city that has super strong and oppressive and repressive laws against human vices, against things that make a city unlivable. But then I also want other options. I want other opportunities, and I want to have the ability to go from this city to a different place. And that has often been the thing that has attracted me to the United States, especially that outsiders often don't understand about the United States, is that the United States was always structured to have a federalist system with competition between and among different states, different cities, and individual states and individual cities have the ability to change their cultures in the ways that their local residents want. And that can and should and does lead to a very diverse country. So let's remember that diversity and different functions of government at different levels is important. Now, I don't intend to move to Singapore, but I appreciate how exceedingly attractive so many of the aspects of the Singaporean society seem to be. I also really respect what they've done over the years with building a competitive niche for themselves. Singapore, at the tip of they're in the Straits of, is it Malacca, is it called? Basically, the tip of the Malaysian peninsula has always been an important center for international trade, and they've really embraced that. And from a business perspective, they've worked hard to create a good value proposition to keep, they're not a zero tax place. They certainly tax their residents, but they have super fair taxes, and the government seems to be extremely efficient. So I'm sure the Singaporeans can have their own list of complaints, but we should pay attention, a lot of attention, to a nation that in 75 years can raise itself from poverty to today. It's not the number one wealthiest nation per capita today. I think it's number 3. Luxembourg, I think, is the current wealthiest nation per capita, but usually in the top 5. Very, very wealthy and prosperous country, and really worthy of respect and study for what they have done. I also think Singapore bears our respect for having influenced the world, especially the world of China, more than perhaps I ever realized before. While I was in Singapore, I was watching a bunch of talks by Lee Kuan Yew, and Lee Kuan Yew was relating and recounting some stories of when Deng Xiaoping came from China and visited him. And Deng was the man who really transformed and opened up the Chinese markets in the 1980s and started the modern Chinese economic miracle. And Singapore, and the example of Singapore, was very influential to him. And Lee Kuan Yew had huge amounts of respect for Deng Xiaoping and his ability, his astuteness, his political savoir-faire, and really was respected of him. So I think Singapore not only trained huge numbers of Chinese in the beginning, and Singaporean universities were very influential, but really just a powerful place. If you ever get the chance to go to Singapore, I would encourage you to do it. Save your money. It's not a cheap place anymore for sure, but it is remarkable. From Singapore, I traveled to Malaysia. And so Singapore and Malaysia are next door neighbors, if you're unfamiliar with that. Formerly together, I forget if they were the same. I don't know fully why Singapore separated from Malaysia when they gained independence from Britain. But the point is, they're next door neighbors. And this was my first time in Malaysia as well. I also really enjoyed my time there. I was only in the capital city of Kuala Lumpur, and that's where I spent the most time for the conference. But most of my time and attention was captured by the conference. I don't have too much to say about Malaysia. I did really enjoy my time in Kuala Lumpur. Andrew Henderson, he of Nomad Capitalist, is a constant advocate of the value of Kuala Lumpur, the value as a city that has all the modern amenities, but yet is not expensive and absurd like in price like Singapore is, has a great residency program, has a great territorial tax system. And I could certainly see all of the stuff that he was saying. Kuala Lumpur, I really enjoyed my time there. And I could see it being a great Asian base that's very accessible. Very English, very widely spoken. You could certainly live and get along very well in Kuala Lumpur without ever needing to learn Malay. And it was a very impressive place. I visited some of the museums, and I learned a lot about the history that was super interesting to me. I've been fascinated by the ending of the British Empire in terms of direct control around the world. When I was younger, I didn't pay much attention in history class. I didn't have much of an interest in it. But as I've gotten older, I've just kind of come to terms with how recent so much of that history is. And the independence of Malaysia, it's a very young nation. So they have many problems that they're still working out, and I wish them all the best. But it was really fascinating to think about how much progress a nation can make in a short period of time, and yet how much work it is to create an independent nation. So I would like to go back and spend more time there, but I could certainly see Kuala Lumpur as being a very good value, good prices, and a very attractive destination for many. From Malaysia, I flew directly to China, and I was excited to do this because I had not been myself physically in China for almost 15 years. It was about 15 years ago that I visited for the most recent time, and I was excited to be there because so much has changed in China. And I spent my time in Shanghai, where I visited some friends and stayed with them, and that was really interesting. By the way, the friends that I stayed with, our husband is a math teacher in an international school. He teaches in the International Baccalaureate program in an international school. And if any of you are teachers and want to be teachers but are annoyed and frustrated with the many times low wages that you may be earning currently, always remember the opportunity to go and work in an international school. And I've recommended this to multiple clients that as one of the ways of taking a great profession and figuring out how to make money on it. And China is often at the top of the pay scale, as is the Middle East. And if you are a qualified teacher, look for opportunities in international schools, because in many cases, your job will arrange all the details for you of an apartment to live in, transportation to and from. You know, my friend lives in a great apartment, nice apartment complex. He has a bus that comes from the school every day, picks him up and various other teachers, takes them directly to the school and then returns them in the evening. He teaches high school, very interesting students from all around the world, and really just seems like a great opportunity, and he makes quite a bit more money than he would make in many other contexts as a high school math teacher. So keep that in mind. Back to the point, going to Shanghai. Wow, what an astonishing transformation China continues to be on. I am fascinated by China, and I have been fascinated for quite a long time. I still don't know what to make of it. I don't know that any of us will know until 50 or 100 years from now when more history books are written. I am amazed by some of the things that I see and hear online, and I'm amazed at how people have two wildly different views. So I look at and listen to China analysts who are convinced that China is absolutely collapsing, the economy is in the process of imploding, that the country is going to basically cease to exist within 50 years or 100 years. Okay. On the other side, I listen to analysts who go on and demonstrate all of the incredible long-term planning that China is doing, and the incredible power that they've built up, and the control that they've built, and the influence they've built on a global scale. And certainly I see the presence of the Chinese and their businessmen all around the world. It's astonishing. I really enjoyed, on the airplane from Malaysia to Shanghai, I was sitting next to a Chinese businessman, and I spent a bunch of time talking to him. He had been in Malaysia to inspect some mines that his company had. He had just come back from South Africa, where they also had a mining interest, and just super interesting to hear some of his stories as basically a middle-grade Chinese businessman, and to hear firsthand of what I know from the kind of the global economic data of just China's involvement all around the world. It is very difficult to be in one of the tier A cities like Shanghai and not be impressed by the visible levels of development. Everything is new. Everything is shiny. Everything is beautiful. The roads are big and wide and modern and not a pothole to be found. Beautifully developed. Fantastic. The cars are all brand spanking new, it seems like. You could never see an old car. I looked and looked, couldn't see an old car. One thing that's very striking about the Chinese automobile marketplace is the total dominance of electric vehicles. I don't know the current numbers, but it's certainly more than 50% EV market domination, and could be significantly higher. But they have got EVs in every part of their economy. One of the things that I found really surprising by my time there was I did not personally see a gas station the entire time I was there in Shanghai. I wasn't intentionally looking for one. I didn't pull up the GPS and say, take me to a gas station. But I look out the windows when I travel, and not a single time did I see a gas station. That's how comprehensive the EV domination is right now in Shanghai. Just huge development, huge towers everywhere, and really astonishing levels of infrastructure development. Going to China is quite overwhelming for those of us who are not from an intensely, densely populated corner of the world. When you come from a lightly populated place like the United States and you go to China, it's hard not to just be overwhelmed by the vastness of the scale of the sheer number of people. I took the train from Shanghai to Hong Kong so that I would have a chance to see the countryside. And one thing that just really impressed me was how huge the cities outside of Shanghai are. You'd be driving the train across the countryside, and for a foreigner like me who doesn't know much about China, you look out the window and there's just these random huge cities everywhere. Now, of course, they're not random, and if I knew China well, I would know the names. But the way that the Chinese cities are developed, with the size of the buildings and the density of the people, they just look like huge cities in the middle of nowhere. And they're cities that I know nothing about. And it's really interesting to see that firsthand. I don't know what to make of things like Chinese real estate. You read in economics journals about the collapse of Chinese real estate. You read about all the malinvestment. If you go on YouTube, you can find all kinds of interesting videos of the Chinese just imploding. You can find the empty cities and them demolishing huge scores of towers. But then just recently, last week, as I'm traveling across the countryside, I see all kinds of new towers being built. And they don't build them one at a time. I took multiple pictures and videos of them building 8 or 10 of them at a time, apartment blocks of 8 or 10, 25, 30-story buildings, all going up at the same time. The ability that they have developed to create large-scale infrastructure and large-scale building projects is astonishing. It is so impressive. And I have an interest even just broader development. You look at what they've done with their high-speed rail lines. You look at the bridges that they have built. The Chinese engineering capacity is a behemoth that is worthy of admiration and respect. Now, is it all the highest quality? I don't know. I didn't see anything that was low quality. I had a great experience with everything that I had. But again, I'm astonished to go online and I see buildings falling apart and bridges falling apart, and I don't know what to make of it. I wonder. All I can say is I'm fascinated. I'm interested to see. I could believe either of these stories. Story number one is I could believe the story of just absolute Chinese domination over the coming centuries. And what I mean by that is the Chinese people is a very ancient and proud race of people with a long history, and in many times in history, incredible domination, even globally. And China over the last century, it's my understanding that many of the Chinese refer to the last century as basically the century of humiliation, that they have experienced constant and never-ending humiliation for the last 100 years. But that's not the story of their people. These are not a people to be taken lightly or trifled with. Extremely intelligent, extremely competent, and you see that being expressed. One of the things that is said about the Chinese people is that they make very long-term plans, 100-year plans, 1,000-year plans. And as an American, I get highly frustrated by the fact that our country seemingly can't seem to think beyond the next 2-year election cycle. And you look at what the Chinese can do if they have a long-term perspective and a political system that doesn't require them to yield to the desires of the people and to the influence of the people, and there's no political accountability whatsoever. And you look and you say, man, this is pretty impressive what a dictator can accomplish. It's pretty impressive what a political a monoparty system can accomplish when they don't have anybody to tell them what not to do. And just their ability to think, to coordinate, to create plans and put them together over the long term is truly astonishing. And so maybe they've just locked up the market. China has big population problems, but maybe we'll see what they do. We'll see them. They're not stupid. They're trying to do something to it. And they've got the Chinese have some strong cultural influences. I'm a great admirer of Chinese entrepreneurs all around the world. The Chinese diaspora all around the world is astonishing. And the Chinese people who emigrate abroad are often just some of the most successful people in almost any country that they land in. Truly impressive people. So I can believe the positive side without a problem. On the flip side, I could totally believe the collapse side. And I think of it historically as something like the Soviet Union. I was not paying much attention to politics during that time. But if I think about the history, the Soviet Union seemed to be an absolute giant, an absolute unconquerable, clearly powerful giant, until all of a sudden it wasn't. And in the fullness of time, the truth that some people said and that some people talked about was fully revealed. It was a very hollow shell. And that was due to many problems, but a huge set of problems related to political system and having a command economy and the failure of central planning. And I've always been persuaded, I won't even say sympathetic. I've been sympathetic, yes, but I've always been persuaded by the long-term probability of failure of any kind of centralized economy. And so maybe that's what's happening. Maybe that is actually what's happening. But in the short term, as an outsider, it's hard to see that. It's hard to see any kind of failure. It's hard to see anything. I didn't come away with anything except respect and admiration and a sense of not humiliation, but just humility in face of the Chinese level of development. It's pretty astonishing to see and to experience. From a political perspective, I'm also fascinated by the complete and total control of the state. In COVID, I think was where this really became obvious and visible from a public perspective. But I'll tell you this: if you want to live in a place where the government is strong and where people have very little personal autonomy, that place is China. I can't see any way that, again, I was only in Shanghai. I wasn't in the rural villages where there's higher poverty and less control, but I can't see any way that you could live any kind of private or self-directed life being in China. The absolute and completely pervasive surveillance state, it's total. It's everywhere, and it's completely inescapable. The facial recognition on everything is just astonishing. And one of the things that really surprised me, well, I'll come back to that in a moment. Let me finish on this theme. It's astonishing. Now, I was thinking a lot about kind of the pros and cons. And so things like the Chinese social credit score. This system, when we hear about it in the West, the idea that everybody has a social credit score, and if you do things that are antisocial, then your score goes down and you find yourself shunned from society. For us in the West, this is just one of the most shockingly gross, horrific human rights things that we can imagine. But I don't see any evidence in the people who are still in China. Of course, many people have fled. I don't see any evidence of the people there in China, not wanting it. I don't speak Chinese, so I don't have personal insight. But what I observed was all the benefits of a social credit score. And what's interesting is travel to a place where, let me give you an example. The worst experience I have ever had on something like public transportation was last year when I went to Atlanta. I myself am a fan of things like public transit. And so whenever possible, I actually enjoy riding the bus, the train, things like that, just to see how the infrastructure in a city works. I don't just always take an Uber. Sometimes I do, but I enjoy taking it. I was traveling by myself. I flew into Atlanta, and I took the train from the airport to the city. It was one of the scariest experiences that I have ever had on public transit, to the point where I was literally taking precautions in case I was going to face some kind of physical violence or assault. On the walls of the train were signs talking about things not to be done. For example, no eating and drinking was probably one. One was no playing loud music. I can't remember what all the ones were. There were 4 or 5, just standard things of decent behavior. And there was a crowd of hooligans on the train. And I looked around, and literally every single rule that was posted on the train was being broken. Every single one right in front of me. And it made me very uncomfortable. And I'm a big guy. I'm not generally uncomfortable. I don't worry too much about physical safety. I was on edge, and I was ready to get up and jump off the train. I was actively avoiding eye contact with anybody, just trying to mind myself and saying, am I going to get there or not? I thought about that when I was in China. And I thought about the value of a social credit score. And you see the value when you see antisocial behavior, and you think about, man, wouldn't it be nice if, hooligans on a train who are blatantly disregarding the rules and causing everyone on the train to be uncomfortable, wouldn't it be nice if there was some kind of punishment for those people? And wouldn't it be nice if it were not something ineffective and stupid, but rather something that was effective until they learned to shape up and be part of the society? And so I can see the benefits of things like a social credit score in the daily experience of the people, or things like crime. One of the great things about having cameras everywhere and having facial recognition on everything and living in a constant surveillance state is there's very little crime. And so you can go out and you don't worry about crime. And you travel to a big city where that stuff isn't. You're worried about crime all the time. And all of a sudden, you're kind of wishing for a little safety. So it was really interesting for me to look at and basically, I guess, just see the benefits and the pros and the cons fairly, and not reflexively react against it, but just experience it. That said, I found it very uncomfortable. It was certainly I couldn't keep any secrets. And that was pretty uncomfortable. For someone like me, who's more of a freedom-oriented person, I'd rather take the risk. I'd rather deal with a little bit of crime, a little bit of antisocial behavior, and just kind of deal with it. It was uncomfortable. But it was certainly eye-opening, and I understood and understand more just from being there and seeing how wonderfully functional society can be when a government has total control of getting rid of the people who aren't going to toe the party line. The other thing that really surprised me in my time in China was how China is cutting itself off from the world. I travel quite a lot, and when I travel, one of the things that I will usually do is I don't usually bother to do much with local currency or any kind of local payment option. I find that a credit card spends just as well, an American credit card spends just as well in just about any corner of the world. And it actually makes my life pretty easy. I don't worry too much about the local currency. I don't go and get tons of cash out of the ATM. I just come and go and, click the Apple Pay and boom, you're on your way. So I expect to be able to do that in most places. And the places that you can't do it is kind of obvious. So, for example, I was in Cuba last year, and Cuba was a catastrophe, but I expected it to be a catastrophe. Cuba has a totally non-functional financial system. It's totally cut off. The sanctions, the collapse, all of the stuff that Cuba faces. And so if you go visit Cuba, you need to bring in physical currency all of the money in stacks of US dollars, all of the money that you're going to spend, because your cards aren't going to work. The data on your phone isn't going to work. Nothing's going to work. And you're just going to bring in stacks of cash. And then even just the conversion system is absurd. In downtown Havana, you go and sit down and have a cup of coffee, and a guy walks up to you and says, "Hey, would you like to change money?" And you say, "Sure." And so you hand him stacks of cash, and he hands you bigger stacks of Cuban pesos, and that's how you get your spending money. So I expected that in Cuba. But China, I don't expect that. I could not run a foreign credit card transaction in any place that I visited in China. Now, I would guess that if I had stayed in a hotel, I would have been fine as far as paying for a hotel. And I was able to buy my train ticket from a tour operator that effectuated the purchase locally. But when I was in China, I couldn't buy anything at the mall. I couldn't buy food. With one exception, at the train station, Burger King was able to accept a foreign credit card. But on the train, nope, no foreign credit card. They have cut off the Chinese society from a lot of outside payment systems. I found that really surprising. The entire Chinese economy basically functions on Alipay and WeChat Pay, WePay, whatever it's called. And it was really interesting to me to see that. I don't know why it is. I read a little bit about it. It seems like it's just a portion of the government's capital controls where they're trying to be really careful about money coming into and leaving China. And so it seems like an element of capital controls. I don't know what to make of it other than to say that it's pretty obvious that this is a country that's pretty well cut off from the rest of the world. Now, can you install Alipay? Yeah, I did it. I installed Alipay and I hooked it up to one of my international credit cards, and eventually I was able to get it to function. And so it is possible. But then, of course, now everything is submitted to the surveillance state of the local area. That now Alipay is set up, and again, you've got full surveillance. But it was just fascinating to me to experience that. And I don't think that bodes well for the long-term future of China. I don't know which of those stories to believe that I described, the highly optimistic or the highly pessimistic of the Chinese future. My guess would be that reality is going to be somewhere in the middle. It's not going to be any kind of extreme thing. But that experience with not being able to buy things with a foreign credit card was quite eye-opening to me. I did not expect that. So then, concluding this part of kind of the Asian travelogue, we finished our trip in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is my favorite city in the world. I love Hong Kong. If you've never been, I would encourage you to go. My first time in Hong Kong was 2004. And it was the first time for me at that time that I had ever experienced Asia and had ever experienced a place that was so astonishingly different from everything I knew and yet so impressive. Up until prior to 2004, I had traveled quite a lot around the United States, had been to Europe. But the close cultural links and even just social feeling of the United States and Europe are very strong. If you've traveled to New York City and you've traveled to Boston, then you're pretty comfortable in Berlin and Paris and London. It's just not that different. It feels pretty much the same in terms of the scale, the intensity. It's not too culturally foreign. Okay, well, maybe it's local language is French or German, but it's not that big of a deal. It's kind of the same. There's a strong cultural heritage and a cultural link between those. And yet, when I got to Hong Kong in 2004, my eyes were completely open to a completely different reality than I had ever understood. If I had to put it in simple words, I was disabused of my automatic American exceptionalism. One of the things that's interesting about the American culture is that Americans are inculcated with the concept of American exceptionalism. And a good portion of that, I think, is right and fairly won. Many aspects of America are truly exceptional, and many elements of American exceptionalism are genuine and true. But that often gets exaggerated in the mind of a person, at least a young person, into kind of a total sense of American exceptionalism. And so when I got to Hong Kong, I was comparing Hong Kong to New York City. And if you're an American, you would say, well, New York City is probably one of the world's greatest cities. And it is. It is truly one of the world's great cities. But when you're in New York City and you're waiting for the subway, you're standing there on the subway platform watching the rats scurry around in the train roadbed. Whereas when you're in Hong Kong waiting for the MTR, the subway, you are basically standing in many stations, something that's as nice as a nice shopping mall. This gleaming, shining, modern transit system. And you're standing there looking around saying, this is crazy. And the sheer density of development. When, okay, you go to downtown Manhattan, all right, great, this is a big city. Then you go to downtown Hong Kong, and on Hong Kong Island, you think, this is just over the top in terms of the sheer density and the level of development. And when I went to Hong Kong in 2004, I spent every hour I could just wandering down every random street I could possibly find. I would jump on the streetcar and ride it out to the end and ride it back again, and jump on the ferry and go back and forth, and jump on some random bus and see where it went. And I would wander down every weird alley that I could find in Kowloon. And it just completely opened my eyes to another dimension of the world. And going back 20 years later, it is different. But it is still astonishing. I don't think that Hong Kong stands alone as perhaps it did 30 or 40 years ago. Hong Kong, if you're unfamiliar with the history, Hong Kong has a somewhat complicated history. But after the Opium Wars, when the Brits defeated the Chinese, then the Chinese, as part of their winning the Opium War, the British took over Hong Kong Island. They were given Hong Kong Island. And then later, they signed a lease agreement for the extension of Hong Kong, which includes Kowloon and the new territories. And so the British ran Hong Kong for over a century. And what Hong Kong always served as at that time was basically this shining pillar of what the Chinese culture could accomplish when given freedom. At the time, this was China going through its century of humiliation and nonstop, never-ending catastrophes with the communists and the Cultural Revolution and all of that. And any Chinese people who could escape to Hong Kong could just be free of that and just build and just make money, right? The basic motto of Hong Kong, make money, la. And that expression of freedom and entrepreneurship and whatnot created one of the most special cities in the world. It is an incredible place. So then in 1997, the British decided that they were going to give Hong Kong back to the Chinese. And at the time, I thought this made a lot of sense because they had signed a 100-year lease, I think, on Kowloon. But as it turns out, there was real story was more complicated than I ever knew anything about. And so the British just decided, you know what, we'll go ahead and give Hong Kong back to the Chinese. But as part of that agreement, the Chinese agreed to manage Hong Kong separately as a special administrative region of China with separate laws and separate rules for, I think, 50 years, if memory is correct. And so China has these two special administrative regions. You've got Hong Kong, that was a territory colony of Great Britain, and you've got Macau, which was run by the Portuguese. And now they're both part of China, but they are special administrative regions. So there's passport control going between them. There's special permits to go back and forth. Over the last few years, though, there's been a lot of political unrest in Hong Kong because the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party have been increasing their weight and control over the nation of Hong Kong and really trying to emphasize the concept of Chinese unity and passing all kinds of new laws, national security laws, and getting rid of all kinds of things. And so there was a big protest movement in Hong Kong in the recent past. And then it seems like the Chinese powers that be have won, and they put all the protesters in jail and the dissidents in jail, and they're basically taking over. And so overall, my experience of Hong Kong was that most of the Hong Kong people that I interacted with just seemed to have a sense of sadness, that just a complete sense of sadness that Hong Kong was a special place, but now freedom is not here. And many, many people have expatriated from Hong Kong, gone to other nations around the world, and more mainland Chinese are moving into Hong Kong. And it's interesting, if you look at videos about this, you'll see the people fighting it out in the comments of people saying, why would you call people from China expatriates? We're one nation. And it was funny because when I was there, the Chinese Communist Party is celebrating the 75th anniversary of its founding. And they were very, very strongly pressing that into Hong Kong, trying to demonstrate one China, we're one nation, one people, we're not separate from China. And even just the things that were always made Hong Kong different. For example, Hong Kong was always a Cantonese-speaking place, and it still is a Cantonese-speaking place. But now, of course, the Chinese Communist Party has basically tried, they haven't done it heavy-handedly, but they've basically tried to get rid of all of the regional variations in all the regional Chinese languages in favor of Putonghua, of the common Mandarin Chinese language, which is a relatively modern invention, has been around for about a century, but is the language that the Chinese are using to try to bring unity to the different ethnicities within the nation of China. So I don't know what to say much about Hong Kong. It seemed sad to me that there's this strong expression of sadness of people feeling like, okay, we just got to get out. We're all on our plan to get out. And who knows what the future will hold. But again, I didn't get a chance on this trip to go to Shenzhen, but I wanted to. I didn't have time. But Hong Kong is no longer the only game in town. You look at a city like Shenzhen, which is just astonishingly developed and so productive there in southern China, right next to Hong Kong. And the world changes. So I don't have much to say. I'm not planning to move to Hong Kong, but I admire it. And I love, again, just like Singapore, this beautiful fusion of classic colonial architecture, classic experience, the century-plus old streetcars and everything related to Hong Kong, mixed with modern development and modern shiny expressions of development. So that was my experience in Asia. In conclusion, I really enjoyed my trip. Thank you for your patience. I mean, not apologize because I did it on purpose. Thank you for your patience with the paucity of podcast episodes. Like sometimes I feel like I've got to go out and live a little bit because I've told you all my stories and I don't have any good stuff left. So I got to go out and live a little bit and get some new stories. Otherwise I won't have anything to talk about. And I was feeling a little dry the last few months of what am I going to talk about? And I don't like that feeling. I like to have an overflow of ideas and concepts and experiences that I want to talk about. And so feeling a little bit better after a few weeks of travel in Asia. And I just want to encourage you that travel is hard, and I think in many cases travel is overrated. But there's just something that you experience about the world by seeing something firsthand. And I think as long as we're honest about it, so I can't hope to have any accurate understanding about what's happening in any of these countries unless I really, really focused on that for a long time and read a couple dozen books on it and listened to the news and followed it and learned the language and really engaged with local people. Then after a few years, I might really have some greater understanding of what's actually happening in that place. But one thing that travel has often done for me is it has been a very effective way of questioning my priors and basically questioning all of the basic assumptions that I've had about the world. Because I can go into the world and I can see with my own eyes and I can say, hey, wait a second. This guy over here that has this just radical off-the-wall idea, I'm sorry, I just can't buy that. I don't see that because I can just see with my own eyes. I can experience. You can't take away what I've seen with my own eyes. And that's been something that travel has often done for me. So I learned a lot. I'm not sure what to do with it all yet, but I've really enjoyed it. And I'm no geopolitical expert. I don't know how you can necessarily take these things and fit them into your portfolio. I don't know. I found myself, it's funny, at Nomad Capitalist Lab, I found myself as basically the strong America promoter. There's a tendency in the world of internationalization where people just automatically, reflexively bash the United States. And this really annoys me. And I've done my fair share of it. I'm quick to acknowledge that, is that I have bashed my own country quite a lot. And some of it fairly and some of it unfairly. And yet I find myself appreciating the United States very much and even promoting the United States because in so many cases, for a lot of the things that the problems that people are trying to solve, the United States truly, in many cases, stands alone as one of the unique solutions to those problems. So I don't think that people should just run away from the United States and run to Asia. But it was interesting to see and to know about. I guess if I had to make a concluding remark, what I would say is what I would wish for my own people, because most of my audience is American. What I'd wish for my own people is I would wish for more of a sense of humility and more of a hunger to solve problems. The humility piece, I think, is really important because a lot of us as Americans tend to be so arrogant where we just kind of reflexively assume without evidence that we've got it all figured out and no one else has anything to teach us. And that's just such a gross and unattractive position. And it just blinds us to the things that we could learn. And so I do wish for more of a cultural sense of humility, not a false humility, not ignoring the things that we've done well at, but a willingness to learn and to say, what should we adapt? What could we adapt? And then I do wish for more of us to really be focusing on solving problems. I know I sound like everyone else when I bemoan our current arguing with one another. But it is really annoying how much time and energy Americans spend arguing with one another instead of solving problems. And the things that we're largely arguing with one another about, we're probably not going to solve in this generation. Hopefully a future generation can find a way to solve some of the things we're arguing about. But let's just focus on solving the things that we can solve. And there's so many things that we can solve, and we can be such a great people, such a great country. We are a great people and a great country, and we can be so much greater. And so I just want to focus on that and do that as much as possible. And I'm not saying don't argue about things that are important. Sure, we need to argue about things that are important. And that basic sense of argument is actually fundamental to the American culture. And it doesn't make us a problem. It's a sign of our diversity. A really important kind of diversity, that of diversity of opinion, perspective, and viewpoint and solutions. So arguing about ideas is a healthy thing. But on the whole, I do worry a lot that we're spending so much time arguing that we aren't really solving much, and we're forgetting how to work together. And we don't need to be the biggest country in the world or the richest country in the world. We don't need to be the top of anything. It's fine. We don't always have to be the biggest and best. But it's really annoying when you have the potential to be great to not be doing the things that are going to lead to that. And so I came away, certainly with looking at the Chinese, I came away with a healthy respect. I already had a healthy respect, but even more of a healthy respect. And I would like to see the Americans and the Chinese working together. I read a book a couple years, year or two ago. And it was called something like General Marshall's War or Unfinished War, or something like that. It was the experience of General George Marshall after World War II when he went to China. And I had never known, until I read that book, I had never known the depth of the American involvement in China. So in that history of China, of course, the Japanese had taken over China, and the Chinese and the Americans had repelled the Japanese. So after the conclusion of World War II, the defeat of Germany and the Axis powers and the defeat of Japan in the Pacific, General Marshall, George Marshall, was hugely important general in the American war effort, was sent to China. And he was sent to China to try to avert a civil war. So at the time, the communists and the nationalists were fighting about the country and who was going to lead the country. And the Americans had close relationship with both, a closer relationship with the nationalists because Chiang Kai-shek's wife was, there was a deep connection with Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Nationalist Party, and his wife had been American educated, spoke English. But the Americans had been very involved in China and had really done quite a lot. And then, of course, Mao Zedong, the leader of the communists. And in the past, I didn't know much about Mao and his education and his care for his people, but I came to respect Mao more than I had previously after reading that book. And the Americans went back and forth trying to bring unity and to the Chinese people. And General Marshall was able to hatch a number of plans that could have brought peace and could have avoided the civil war between the communists and the nationalists. But as it turns out, basically, my summary of it, the nationalists were just too stupid to listen, and they were too convinced that they were going to be right, and they were too convinced that they had the United States by whatever body part you want to say them by, and that they could just do whatever they wanted. The United States would stand up and support them, and basically the United States finally withdrew, and then ultimately the communists won. The nationalists were expelled to Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan with his followers, and that's where you established the nation of Taiwan, and the communists took over China. And what I learned from that book, really interesting point of history, but what I learned from that is I just learned about how if a people ignores the real problems, at the end of the day, they're going to be ushered out of power. The nationalists were the ones who probably should have had the most widespread support of the people. But their corruption and their unwillingness to actually listen to the problems and actually solve the problems that were being faced ultimately was their downfall. It ultimately led to their destruction. And I've seen that so much in even just thinking about colonialism, traveling to some of these former colonies. The colonialism argument is really interesting. It's very much in vogue to talk about colonialism, and it's very common today to be basically against colonialism. And on the whole, that's probably the right solution. The reason I hedge my bets a little bit is that I think in general there's a good argument to be made that in many cases the colonies of the European powers and the other empires that took them over, the colonies probably gained more than the actual colonial powers did on the whole. But the problem was that the colonial powers were so brutal and so stupid and so sinful and destructive and so just cruel to the people that they destroyed their ability to have it. And I think back even to the American War for Independence. The Americans at that time, I think fairly, didn't want to secede. They tried to appeal to King George, and King George's obtuseness and his unwillingness to be at all flexible to the concerns of the American colonies is what ultimately led to the war for independence and the Americans eventually winning and breaking away. And I think you see that same pattern in so many colonies and former colonies around the world, that if the empire would just not be evil and would just listen and not be cruel, then the empire could probably continue. But what happens is that humans kind of get addicted to their evil, and they just kind of say, well, I'm so big and strong and powerful, I don't have to listen to anybody, I can just do what I want. And that seems to so often lead to their downfall. And whether it was the nationalists, the Chinese nationalists, and getting wiped out by the communists, because the people were rising up and saying, like, listen, we've got problems and you're being jerks. And the communists were fitting the needs. Or in so many other examples, or perhaps even in today, is that if politicians and leaders don't listen to the concerns of their people, they're not going to be around for very long. They're going to be ushered out, and someone else is going to come in. So it's probably not as profound as it in my expression of it as it seemed to be in my mind, but it was a lesson that I took from even just these recent travels. And I really worry about my own country, and I worry that we're walking down that pathway. And that really bothers me, because I don't want to see that happen. So to the extent that you and I have the ability to change course, let's be humble and let's listen to the needs and the response of the people that we have responsibility over and for and power over. And let's be strong leaders, and let's do what we can to reform our own people, lest we suffer the same fate. Thank you for listening to my travel log. I hope you enjoyed some of my adventures. I enjoyed having them, but I'm glad to be back to work, and I'll be back with you very soon.